Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a new book by Margaret A. Burnham entitled By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners, published by W.W. Norton just over a month ago. And joining us this afternoon as discussants are Alelia Bundles and Alex Lichtenstein. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, which is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. For over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center, and, well, since the pandemic, here in the virtual realm. Behind the scenes are two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. On the logistics front, please note today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar a bit later, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. If you use the raise hand function, I get to call on you and you get to pose your question directly. If you use the Q&A function, I get to read your question. We prefer the former to the latter, but both are fine. And with those preliminaries out of the way, let's get started. It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our author, Margaret A. Burnham, who is the founding director of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern University. She has served as a staffer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a civil rights lawyer, a defense attorney, and a judge. A professor of law, she was nominated by President Biden and confirmed by the U.S. Senate to serve on the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Review Board. She lives in Boston, Massachusetts, and today she will be speaking on her new book, By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners, published by Norton on September 27th. Margaret, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. We're delighted you're here.
Thank you so much, Eric. I greatly appreciate being here at the Washington Seminar, and I thank the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center for pulling together this utterly wonderful series and for inviting me to participate. Let me just say a few words about the book, and then I'm really looking forward to a robust conversation with Alia and with Alex and with our audience participants. This project started really in 2007. That was the year President Bush adopted and signed the Emmett Till Cold Case Act. The purpose of the Emmett Till Cold Case Act was to revisit cold cases from the civil rights era, really from the 1954 to 1967, 1968 civil rights era that had not been properly prosecuted, and to determine whether or not prosecutions were still possible, and if not, what other remedies might be available to the families. We started, we here at the law school began looking at some of those cases and considering how we might help those families. And we quickly discovered that there were other families whose cases would not be included in the Emmett Till examination because the cases predated that period. These were cases from the 1930s and 1940s. And as we began looking at these cases, looking at the newspaper articles and the DOJ records that told us these stories, it became quite clear to us that there were families out there who had not fully understood, not fully appreciated the records that were available to them that might fill in holes in their own family history, and that perhaps equally importantly, and certainly importantly for this book, that there was an American history story that had not yet been fully accounted for, not yet been fully documented. And that's where the book and the archive that accompanies the book really started. So the archive is a collection of documents, both collected from family members and from government agencies and from local authorities, detailing accounts of 1,000 homicides, racially based, racially motivated homicides from 1930 to 1954 in the states of the former Confederacy. The book builds on those cases, but it also builds out the arguments. So the archive itself are just the raw documents. The book tries to complexify and situate the documents and the stories that the document tells in a broader view of Jim Crow, the law, and violence in the American experience. And I focus, obviously, I focus obviously on, lots of people have written about Jim Crow. My book really, I think, reveals new elements of the way in which violence shaped the Jim Crow period and the way in which Jim Crow violence continues to shape our experience with law today. And so I focus on three I look at three perspectives. Look at this through three lenses. First of all, again, the violence. What was the nature of the violence? Obviously different from today, different from the Reconstruction period, different from slavery. In what ways did the violence reinforce and create Jim Crow? And secondly, I look at the role of the federal government, which I think is key here. And the DOJ documents that we uncovered allowed us to reconstruct the role of individual prosecutors from Washington and those DOJ officials located in the states as they confronted this violence and as they grappled with local officials in an effort to manage the violence. And what we find through these documents is that the federal government failed dismally in responding to enforcing the constitutional rights of ordinary African Americans who were subjected, whose daily lives were conditioned by, confined by, and shaped by this violence. And finally, I look at the resistance, and obviously. We know that the civil rights movement is a long civil rights movement that's been fairly well established. And we know as well that the resistance that characterized the movements of the 1960s, movements of the 1950s, 1960s, and that have been so well documented by historians, go back to the 1930s, 1940s. We see the 1930s as a decade of struggle, a period when the labor movement, the left movement, responses to the Great Depression, all energized activity across the country and obviously affected the South as well. I look not just at the 1940s, but then, through the 1930s, but then through the 1940s, the war story. What happens when our soldiers, our African-American soldiers travel to these Jim Crow locations? What happens to them and what is it that they bring back to their communities? And here my book is a partner with a really wonderful book that is also out in 2022 by Matthew Delmont. It's called Half American, just came out this year, which tells a story, a far more complete story than I tell in my book about the experience of African American soldiers and details both sides of the so-called Double V campaign. So those are the themes that the book deals with, the three themes here, violence. I'm not just talking about structural violence, but I'm really talking about the direct physical violence that really shaped people's lives. And here I'm talking about not just the ordinary violence that working class people across our country and really indeed across the world have endured as a condition of life, but really something that's quite more remarkable, quite more catastrophic, quite more disastrous in African American life during this period of time when African Americans had no control over their political realities. So these are lives that are governed really by the necessity to avoid violence. And again here, and why this account of violence today? Well, obviously, this is, we continue to decipher and respond to the George Floyd moment. And so we need to understand what the old Jim Crow looked like in order fully to appreciate where we are today, what our structural constraints and realities are today. But also, so But in addition to this historicized account of violence and a consideration of its relationship to what realities today, this is really also just a historical account of the violence. So it's history for its own sake. It's history for filling in and fully understanding the nature of Jim Crow and the ways in which it was experienced by communities all across the South. So if I have a moment more, and I think I do, let me just say that the book opens with a chapter on rendition. And here I argue that the relationships between Southern communities and those in the North, and here I choose for a fuller examination, Detroit, are such as to knit together a national community of resistance, national African-American community of resistance, aided by newspapers, but aided as well at this point by professional communities who have emerged in Detroit and in Harlem and in Chicago. And here I'm speaking specifically about lawyers who are able to assist those who are running away from violence in the South. And this is a story that has not been well told, really understudied and underconceptualized. And I link it as one obviously would to the story of the Underground Railroad, and what I describe is what I consider to be a new Underground Railroad, an Underground Railroad that emerges and now involves federal courts and state courts and gubernatorial offices in the receiving states. And I describe the relationship between those receiving states and the insistence on white supremacy, even in their arguments that these folks should be returned in the demanding states. And so that's the first chapter, and then as well, I move into this question of what I call raced transportation, and using here the experience of soldiers who were forced to travel Jim Crow in the South, even when their white counterparts were allowed to ride wherever they wanted to on the buses. And so I use this really as an opportunity to describe kind of not just the spatial violence of the bus, but also to lift up some cases that I think are critically important to fully understand what World War II was all about on the home front, but also to understand the heroism of these soldiers. One of the cases involved a soldier from Durham, North Carolina, a fellow by the name of Booker Spicely, whose story is not really well known. Booker Spicely gets on a bus in Durham, North Carolina on a Saturday night in his uniform. And when a white soldier gets on a few stops later, Spicely is asked to move to the back of the bus. He complains to the bus driver. He says, "I'm not used to this. I'm from Philadelphia. I'm not from Durham." Words are passed between the bus driver and Spicely. Long story short, as he exits the bus, he tries to apologize to the bus driver. "I'm sorry if I offended you. It was too late." The bus driver follows Spicely off the bus and shoots him dead on the sidewalk in Durham, North Carolina. Bus driver continues his ride and is then tried and acquitted. And I use that not only to lift up the name of Booker Spicely and put it alongside the stories of other soldiers whose courage is well known, but also to describe the federal response, which was obscene in this case. The federal government sent an agent to Durham, North Carolina, an undercover agent to Durham, North Carolina, the Army here, not so that there would be some oversight of the state prosecution or the state investigation, but rather to investigate resistance within the African-American community. And so we see this not just in the Spicely story, we see it again in 1940 when a man is killed in Tennessee for trying to register to vote, not registering, but trying to register to vote. And the FBI, in this case, it's the FBI that sends its agents down, not fully to investigate this, in that case, it was a lynching, but rather to tamp down on and surveil the African American community. So that's the second chapter, and then I move on to investigate a particular region here in order to get deep down in the interstices of the Justice Department. I investigate the prosecution of racial violence cases in the Middle District of Alabama. The Middle District of Alabama includes Montgomery and it includes Tuskegee. And what I do here is trace the career, as far as racial violence is concerned, of one particular prosecutor. His name is Parker, who takes on a case at the very inception of his tenure as a federal prosecutor. And he loses it because that courtroom is swamped with police officers from all over the state who are supporting the sheriff defendant in the case. And so he goes home and decides, or he goes home, and whether he decides or not, never takes another case. And so, I talk about the ways in which local law enforcement and these prosecutors, although wearing the mantle of the federal government, they were federal prosecutors, they are nevertheless fully integrated socially, culturally, and oftentimes professionally in these local communities. So it becomes impossible for them, even if they so desired, to respond to this. And of course, I describe the ways in which this local prosecutor is not able to, the federal government is not able fully to control the behavior of this local prosecutor, who eventually has his way. I talk about the U.S. versus Screws, which is a case in which the United States Supreme Court ultimately weakens the Reconstruction era laws that were adopted along with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to control Klan violence during the Reconstruction period. Those laws lay fallow until the early 1940s, and then the Supreme Court comes along and takes another, and chops away at them a little bit more. And so I describe how that happened, how it happens that we come into the 1950s with really no federal code apparatus adequate to the challenge of racial violence. I describe Black protest, and here I use Birmingham as my laboratory. Well, Birmingham's a violent city. It's a labor town. It's a town of intense racial divides. And it's also a town of enormous resistance, all forms of resistance, both radical resistance, reformist resistance, resistance by women, either organized or unorganized. And so I try to make an account of all the ways, and here I'm using police violence really as the laboratory to think about how lynching goes underground. It goes into the police station. Birmingham offers a great example of that, where you have a population that is 1/3 Black, and probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 95% of those killed by police in this town are African American. And so I talk about both the newspapers and other forms of resistance in Birmingham, including describe the case of a man who is killed he's a steel worker, killed by owners of the mine, TCI in this case, Tennessee Coal and Iron, and how at the end of after his killing, miners leave the mines in a wildcat strike. So these kinds of forms of resistance, from the courthouse to the church to the cemetery to the workplace, are all evidenced in this chapter on Birmingham. And then, then I wrap up with two chapters, one of which looks at looks uniquely at the problem of kidnapping. And here I use this as a way of talking about how law gets distorted by non-use, what we in the legal community call desuetude, the failure to apply laws which appear on their face to be generally applicable when the victim is African American. And I argue here, I suggest here, I'd say I suggest here, and open for further exploration, further research, whether or not the failure to prosecute kidnapping is a direct legacy of slavery. When you, as you know, an enslaved person, white person said, you go here, go there, go to the next place, you had to go. You didn't have any choice. You couldn't say no. You couldn't say wait. You couldn't say come get me tomorrow. You had to go. So there was no such thing by definition as kidnapping during slavery. And what I argue here is that for all sides, for both the kidnappers as well as the kidnapped, and Emmett Till is a good example. A white person comes to your house, they knock on the door, they say, come with me. You go. And that's a kidnapping, but it was never charged up as a kidnapping. And I just use that as one example of the ways in which common practice distort norms and distort formal law. And then finally, the final chapter really is an exhortation to readers and to the American public to take this history sufficiently seriously so that we appreciate the need for remedy. And here I say that we're behind the times, that all over the world, folks are creating, crafting, talking about, developing new discourses and new language around remedies. And here in the United States, we've not done that. And I argue that this particular group of individuals, those who suffered from the losses that I describe in this book, not so long ago, we're not going back to slavery days, we're going to back within the lifetimes of many of us in this room today, that those individuals deserve to be recognized, acknowledged, the subjects of apology, and the subject of material reparations. And I argue here, we've done this before. The Civil Liberties Act is an example of that, and it should be done in this case. Briefly, Eric, that's the book.
And there's a lot more in it as well, but we're going to get to that. So thank you so much. Our first discussant this afternoon is A'Lelia Bundles, the author of On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, a New York Times notable book about her entrepreneurial great-great-grandmother and the inspiration for Self-Made, the fictional Netflix series starring Octavia Spencer. She's at work on The Joy Goddess of Harlem, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, about her great-grandmother, whose parties, arts, patronage, and international travels helped define the era. A former network television executive and producer at ABC News and NBC News, she's on the advisory board of the Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute, and a founder of the Madam Walker Family Archives. Welcome back to the Washington History Seminar.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you for letting me be a part of this conversation. Professor Burnham, I thank you for writing by hands now known, and for developing a database that will provide material for legal scholars for decades to come, and that has provided the potential to help families and communities find some measure of resolution and justice. You've created a powerful, devastating, and damning body of evidence that reveals just how routine racially motivated murder was and how normal it was for murderers to go unpunished. Especially this year, as we've seen the passage of the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, more than a century after federal anti-lynching legislation was first proposed, and with the recent release of Till, the movie, we are reminded of Mamie Till Mobley's courage to force others to see, as she said, what they did to my boy. But your book reveals the stories of 1,000 Emmett Tills who died between 1930 and 1954, and how normalized and accepted and approved of those murders were. With each story that you tell, we see the humanity of each person, as well as how individual lives were destroyed and how families have endured generational trauma. Another part of the story is how the cover-ups and the denials still rumble today beneath the surface in the communities where the murders happened. You showed that violence was necessary to sustain Jim Crow. We like to believe that that type of violence is a thing of the past, but we know that in 2022, violence has returned to the political arena. We also know that voter suppression and vigilante monitoring of polling places and drop boxes intimidates and has the effect of denying rights. I especially appreciate the way you've structured the book, beginning with the heartbreaking and infuriating story of Ollie Hunter, as you set the stage for how arbitrary and cruel these murders could be. As you just described, the various sections, rendition, race transportation, patter rollers, and prosecutors, and the screws effects, those sections knit together intimate personal stories with the legal records and the judicial response. As a scholar, I commend you for being so measured in your presentation of the facts of these horrific cases. But I have to admit that it was gut-wrenching to read about armed bus drivers who were empowered to shoot Black passengers on a whim, and even more problematic that they did so with impunity. I could only shake my head when you described how the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. was hamstrung by the refusal of local Southern prosecutors to move on cases so they could maintain their standing in their communities and protect friends and elected officials who were complicit in these murders. As I read about these past injustices, I also felt concern about the impact that a change in the balance of power in Congress might have in 2022, or what it means to appoint judges who feel less than obliged to follow the rule of law, or how a Supreme Court that privileges states' rights might rule on critical cases. At the same time, it was encouraging to learn that your project was able to push to have John Earl Reese's cause of death amended on the official death certificate, and that the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project is framing discussions about reparations for the descendants of those who were murdered and whose land was taken. The desire to cover up and to gloss over historical facts is playing itself out in 2022 as state legislatures and school boards pass laws and create policies that make it illegal to tell the kinds of truthful, accurate, and yes, painful stories that you are telling. In many ways, reading, writing, learning, and teaching have become acts of resistance, but perhaps it's always been that way for scholars and authors who are excavating records that reveal truths long buried. So I have a couple of questions, but first, the first one, I'm just wondering if you could talk about the meaning of the title By Hands Now Known, and then I'm particularly interested in how your students are trained and prepared for their research and investigation, and how you use the War Department's Negro transportation files and Department of Justice records at the National Archives. Thank you.
The title borrows from two spaces. Many folks know that when these cases were written up by coroners or other officials and described on death certificates, the term "by hands now not known" was used to obscure the reality that everyone knew who committed these crimes. If you're talking about lynching, obviously we all know about the crowds that gathered around and the photographs that were taken and the children that were brought to these sites. That's one thing, but many of our cases take place in a police station, and there are many eyes on these crimes. So folks know how these crimes took place and who's immediately responsible. So certainly it borrows from that. The second part of the title by Jim Crow's Legal Executioners borrows from a book that came out about 15 years ago called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And here I'm trying to suggest the structural dynamics of what occurred during this period. And again, I didn't want to write a book that was just about blaming, naming, and shaming. Although individual responsibility is obviously critical to a full reckoning with the period. So families need to know, where they stood and who did what and so on. But it's not just about that. It's also about describing the structural and systemic mechanisms by which this system was maintained and the potential of its replication. And so that's on the two sides of the colon. The students went to these places. They met with the family members. That was a critical part of their education. So these are people who are being trained in law and in journalism, graduate students in law and journalism, and we're training them to work with facts. That's what they're going to do over the course of the professional lives. What's a fact? Where do you find it? How do you write about it? How do you use a fact? So, but they also had to figure out how to get the information. And for that, they had to go to places. They had to interview people who were very much not like them in so many ways. And so it turned out to be really vitally important and enriching educational material for the students, and obviously useful material as well for the communities that were affected. You had a third question. I'm sorry, I've forgotten it, Alia.
No, it was really just the use of those War Department. I think it was Negro transportation files.
Yeah. I wanted to say something about it. That's why I asked you. So the Negro transportation, maybe others have found this. I haven't found it cited anywhere else. So here's the researcher in me with, the gloves and the tinted, the glasses and all. So I'm up in the archives digging through these files. And there's a guy over there at College Park who's responsible for the military files. This is when I was writing my chapter on race transportation. And he says to me, this might be of interest to you. And it turns out that the War Department headquartered in Georgia maintained an account of racial incidents on buses throughout the territory responsible that this particular unit of the War Department was responsible for. There's about 4 or 5 states, including North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, I can't remember the others. And so they took a survey from bus companies. If there were an incident on a bus involving a racial incident on a bus, whether it involved a soldier or not, the bus companies agreed to take notes about those incidents and turn them into the War Department. And hence the Negro transportation file. This was designed really to give them a sense of what was going on with their soldiers who were riding these buses. But it's a far greater significance for those of us who want to know what kinds of resistance were being practiced during this period of time. And it tells us a lot about, in particular, the resistance of those most frequent riders, women who had to ride those buses, African-American women who had to ride those buses to get back and forth to work. So it's a wonderful find. I urge folks to take it in 1,000 different directions. I think it supports that kind of research.
Yeah, well, so bless the National Archives and the researchers who help us when we're trying to find something new. That is an amazing find.
Yeah.
Before we move on, let me remind folks, if you have questions, raise hand function is one way. The Q&A function is another. We have a couple of hands coming up. Excellent. That's very good. Our second discussant this afternoon is Alex Lichtenstein. a professor of history and American studies at Indiana University, and he's the former editor-in-chief of the American Historical Review. He served there from 2017 to 2021. His most recent books are Margaret Bourke-White and the Dawn of Apartheid, based on a photography exhibit that he curated in South Africa, and he co-authored the book with Rick Halpern, which was published in 2016. Also, Marked, Unmarked, Remembered, A Geography of American Memory, published in 2017. It was a collaboration with his brother, a photojournalist, Andrew Lichtenstein. Alex is an historian of race, labor, and incarceration, amongst many other things, and his essays on South African history and politics have appeared in the LA Review of Books, the Johannesburg Review of Books, and most recently, Public Books. Alex, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, Margaret and Lelia, for setting the table so nicely. It's really a tremendous honor, actually, to participate in this, Margaret. And and I found the book very moving, as I'll explain. So really, I've been waiting so long for this book, is the way I think about it. Much of my career, like Eric's, like many of us, has been spent tracing, reading about, teaching about the extraordinary violence that anchored white supremacy in the American South between the overthrow by force of radical Reconstruction and the mid-1960s and the civil rights revolutions. Although the phenomena that I have usually paid attention to, and I think most other historians, mob violence, lynching, convict leasing, the chain gang, the Wilmington coup, the murder of Emmett Till, the murder of Goodwin, Schwerner, and Cheney, none of those things can be termed exceptional, and yet I think they do tend to be understood as lying at the very extreme end of violent racial dominance. I've long insisted, however, especially to young people who often tell me nothing has changed, that prior to, say, 1965, Black people in much of the US South effectively lived in a totalitarian society. Most students ignore me when I point this out. But to put it another way, in a country allegedly governed by the rule of law, African Americans in the South lived instead in a permanent state of exception. And I think your book, Margaret, makes that very, very clear. The 1961 murder of SNCC activist Herbert Lee in Mississippi by state legislator E.H. Hurst, for example, though shocking to civil rights activists in the North at the time, seems all too typical. That's just one example, right, of this during the civil rights era. And I think, as is common knowledge, when people started looking for Emmett Till's body in the Tallahatchie River, many other bodies were taken out of the river, people whose names perhaps were never known, certainly people who murdered African Americans whose cases never even came to light. So as I began to read Margaret's gripping and, yes, profoundly disturbing, one likes to think one's inured to this, but it really, no. As I began to read, these are the words that leapt out at me from the very first pages. Commonplace encounter, quotidian violence, unpredictable violence. I do think that it's the unpredictability that is so terroristic in these situations. Mundane violence, and of course, the completely intertwined nature of local police authority and the private use of terror. As Margaret puts it, law needed terror and terror needed law. I mean, a lot of the book is very good at showing how this wasn't just a question of vigilante violence and lynching. These were often acts carried out by people who had the law on their side, who had a badge and a gun legally, and then could carry out murder with impunity. I found myself, in fact, thinking that an amazing project that no one has done yet would be a collective biography of the many sadistic racists who served as sheriffs in these communities. I mean, almost every one of these counties in Alabama and Georgia, one that I know well from my research is Willis McCall in Lake County, Florida. But I mean, these are not exceptions. There's so many of these sheriffs. Finally, I was repeatedly struck in the book by how quickly all whites would resort to violence at the merest perception of a slight, a challenge, a wrong look, word, or gesture on the part of their Black fellow citizens. I shouldn't have been surprised, but honestly, I kept asking myself as I read this book, why are these white folks so damn mad all the time? Why are they so quick on the trigger? The other thing worth noting about this book, it's been alluded to already, is its collaborative nature. The vision surely is Margaret's, yet as she notes in her acknowledgments, it took the extraordinary research by Jay Driscoll in the NAACP and Justice Department papers. I feel like I had a glimpse of this process because occasionally when he would have a great find, he was so excited he posted on social media. So it was wonderful to watch that research in real time. And I finally put that together as I read the book. I was like, oh, this is what Jay was working on all those years. It took the sharp eye of Nan Woodruff from Penn State, who herself has been deeply engaged in commemorative efforts in Elaine, Arkansas, the site of a famous or infamous 1919 racial massacre. It took the work of MIT political scientist Melissa Nobles. It took considerable digging that we've already alluded to by students at Northeastern University. Most of all, it took the willingness of the family members, descendants, and community members to revisit the traumatic memories of racial terror in these communities. That, to me, is such a central contribution of this research. I have three questions I'd like to see us discuss. One is something of a challenge to Margaret, maybe not, but and the other is more of a request for some speculation. First, the challenge. Although this view has become somewhat unpopular, I personally continue to cling to what has been called the myth of Southern exceptionalism, namely the notion that there was something qualitatively distinctive about the deployment of racist terror in the US South in the 20th century. That's not to deny, of course, the significance of racism and racist police brutality in the North or in California, nor certainly to deny the complicity by omission of federal law enforcement and courts so effectively documented in this book. And yet, by hands now known to my mind, it seems to add a lot of evidence to the idea that there was something different about the nature of racist violence in the South. Whether it was over the fights of rendition, and I think you're absolutely right, Margaret, this is a highly original contribution, linking that question of rendition, for instance, to fugitive slave defense by communities. Or whether we're talking about the experience of African-American soldiers in the South who were simply baffled by the obstacles they faced if they had traveled there from the North. The chapters on rendition in particular, I think, stand out here. Fugitives, community activists, the courts, and occasionally the sympathetic governor or state authority all recognized that to extradite a Black person southward was to sign a death warrant. And again, it wasn't just saving them victims of violence, it was saving people who were fleeing what they knew was going to be an unfair trial in the courts or time on the chain gang or potentially violence, right? And so there was enough recognition in the North that this was the case that sometimes people weren't sent back south. I was really struck by Frank Murphy, the governor of Michigan, who of course has a very interesting record because he's the one, I think you alluded to this, what's the precedent for redress? It's Korematsu, right? It's the Japanese American internment cases. Who dissented in that case? Frank Murphy. He is a particularly interesting and heroic figure. I was really struck by that, really interesting. All that said, I think, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Margaret, but I think you seemed a bit ambivalent about advancing an exceptionalist argument here. I can't quite tell. So to lay down a question after I'm done, was the South actually different? A second related question is this: why the extraordinary resort to interpersonal violence by Southern whites? What made them so quick to anger? What were they so afraid of? As B.J. Busher, one of the things I love about this book is the way you really bring not just people's names forward, but their backstories. You make them whole people as they encounter this violence. As B.J. Butcher, who was someone who was ejected from a bus by an armed white driver, not murdered, I don't think, maybe I have that wrong. As he observed after the bus driver sort of started cursing him out, he sort of mutters under his breath, white folks, I forgot. That phrase, I think, says it all, and yet it still leaves the need for some kind of explanation about why white folks behaved this way. Finally, Margaret seeks to draw an activist through line from the protests against police brutality in Birmingham in particular, but not exclusively, in the 30s and the 40s, to the mobilizations of the 1960s, to Black Lives Matter today. The fight against murder under the color of law in particular seems to be a strong continuity. I'm sympathetic to this view. I'd even say some of it rests on lineal descendants of these particular struggles, like Margaret herself. Some of you may know her father was Lewis Burnham, a Southern Negro Youth Congress activist in Birmingham in the 1940s, and her mother, Dorothy Burnham, who Margaret said would be in attendance, was also an activist in those struggles in Birmingham at the time. Margaret also was attending Tougaloo College during Freedom Summer, and now, of course, is engaged in the activist research into cold cases from those eras. So your life itself is a direct example and evidence of that very continuity. The circle is unbroken in this case. Yet, does this mean that the circumstances of struggle have not changed? And I think you suggest that they have. So just as I want to shore up the idea of Southern exceptionalism, I'd also like to press against the idea of unchanging racism. I don't think you'd suggest that, but I'd like to hear more about how you think things have and have not changed over the past, let's say, 80 or 90 years. Well, police violence directed at Black people certainly remains a scourge in this country. 1944 was probably different from 1964, and 2024 is yet something else again, at least for now. So the fact that Burl Jones, another one of these characters, was able to return home to Natchez, Mississippi after having to flee in 1964 after being kidnapped by the Klan. And yes, I think you're absolutely right, Margaret. This is, the hangover of slave patrols. He was able to return without risking life and limb. That itself is a marker of change. As the book concludes, the struggle today, while ever mindful of the poison root of our current criminal justice system, the struggle today is very much about redress and memory, a process, by the way, that I think can hold the federal authorities, whose complicity was one of inattention and denial at best, can hold them to account as well. I wanted to end just with an image with that in mind, this question of redress and remedy and really memory and why that's a struggle still. So Margaret begins her book with a reminder that I had forgotten, actually, that the first Supreme Court case that essentially undermines federal commitment to civil rights is the Cruikshank case in 1873. I had forgotten that it was an effort to punish the whites who engaged in this massacre in 1873. And yet this sign was put up by the state of Louisiana in 1950 something, I think it's 1950, which refers to the Colfax riot in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. That does not sound like a riot to me. That sounds like a racial massacre. This event, however, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Now, I hope that sign isn't still standing there in Colfax, Louisiana, but I'm not 100% sure that that's the case. But certainly this struggle over memory as part of the effort of redress is central to the conclusion of this book. And again, what makes it so powerful is you getting the students out there into these communities, talking to the people and their descendants who lived through this, and of course, who have not forgotten it, and nor have their white neighbors, even if they might deny the fact that it's still part of their consciousness. So thank you very much for doing this book. Thank you very much, Eric and WHS, for allowing me to comment, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Margaret?
much. Thanks so much, Alex. And I want to thank Aaliyah as well for both your comments and for having given the book such a close read, and also for your work. Obviously, none of us is working in a vacuum. We're all building on each other's work. I feel a kinship with Aaliyah's work on Harlem. My father was born and raised in Harlem during the C.J. Walker era. And Alex, thanks so much for your work on both South Africa and on memory, all critically important themes to taking us to the moment where we are today. And I also just want to thank Leela as well for reminding us that as we sit here tonight, the night before election, that none of this should be discussed in a vacuum. So thanks for that. On the 3 questions, Alex, first of all, on the Southern exceptionalism thing, I think that's outside of my powers of expertise. I'm a legal historian. I'm not a historian, and what I've looked at are events in a particular place. We turn to the South because that's where the cases were, like bank robbers and banks. But nevertheless, we haven't really looked at Maryland or Kentucky or Oklahoma or California or those states yet to really begin thinking about. And also, we're just thinking about African Americans here. This is exclusively focus on violence as it affected African Americans. There's a much broader story to be told. One of my colleagues, Monica Martinez, tells the story of violence against lethal violence against Mexicans and Mexican nationals, Mexican Americans on the Texas border at the turn of the 20th century. So this work is ongoing, and I don't know enough to say whether the South was exceptional. All I know, exceptional relative to the rest of the country. All I can say is that it was an exceptionally violent place. Thank you for lifting up the name of Frank Murphy. Justice Murphy was not only appointed to the Supreme Court justice after his by FDR after his wonderful work in Detroit on the Ocean Suite case and on some of the cases that I discuss in the book, but Murphy was also in the Justice Department in 1939 when the Justice Department first opened a unit to address violence. That at that point we were talking about violence in the labor movement, but obviously racial violence and other forms of constitutionally implicated violence were also at stake in Murphy's leadership of this new unit. So, why the extraordinary violence by ordinary people is it's easy to dehumanize. Unfortunately, history teaches, I've got nothing but historians on the screen here, that dehumanizing people is an easy task. We've done it over and over and over again, and it's that. I think it's that. One could also posit other reasons, and people have posited other reasons. The labor, that people were either trying to keep labor in the South or trying to get people off the farms, whatever it was. There are all these other reasons, all these other, correlations that economists and sociologists draw to describe the violence. That all may be true. What I have observed here is that it was just coming off of slavery is very easy to dehumanize an entire group of people, and that explains why it was so frequent and routine, why the violence could be enacted in these ways that were just that signified people as non-humans. That's really what's at the root of it. Whether there are economic and sociological and political factors that also help us understand what was going on in the South during the period I'm studying, that is all there as well. So then your third question is, have circumstances changed? And a lot has changed. The cases, thank you for calling out Jay Driscoll's work and Melissa Noble's and Nan Woodruff and Jeff Ward, professor of sociology at WashU, who's also working in this field. I have so many colleagues who have come together to really support this inquiry into the nature of authoritarianism and its relationship to totalitarianism, as you've called it, and its relationship to violence. The work of Daniel Maguire looking at gender and violence in her book, The Dark End of the Street. So may the work continue. But on the question of whether things have changed, the cases that are in our archive would not be found today. That's not to say that that African Americans don't continue to be vulnerable, but not at the same rate, not for the same reasons. Folks are voting. They are present on every landscape of American discourse and American exchange, American politics. And that's what makes the difference. In the South, that simply was not true. You couldn't vote. If somebody killed your kid, you could not get a hearing at City Hall. You could not call the sheriff's wife who went to church with your cousin and say to that woman, please talk to your husband. You couldn't do that. And that's what that's why we call it authoritarianism. And and this realization that actually we've been here before. We've actually been here before. I think adds something to what political scientists who've worked in this field and studied authoritarianism in Latin America, in Africa, in other places across the world have not really taken as close a look as we need to about the dynamics of that process in places where people were subjected to these inhumane forms of subordination without any political recourse whatsoever. And that's the difference. And I think it's a critical difference. And, we undersell history by not recognizing that difference, and that's why I say I'm looking at this as a historical moment. Yeah, I know I couldn't answer the question about Southern exceptionalism, but I am looking at this as a particular historical. This is what was going on there, right? And is there a dotted line to today? Obviously, right? Have we filled in all the blanks to that dotted line? Not yet. Right. But it's also you never know. You can't really read the moment that you're living in because you're living in it. But you can read what historians do. You can read an earlier moment because the documents help you reconstruct it. And that's, I think, a good part of what I'm trying, whether I'm successful or not, only the future will tell. But that's a good part of what I'm trying to do here.
Thank you very, very much, all of you. We have a number of hands up. I'm going to first call on Dan Letwin. If you would unmute yourself, you can pose a question. And Michael Binder, you're up next, so stand by.
Thank you. And it's an honor to meet you, Dr. Burnham. I, like others, found your book riveting and devastating. The brutality and the more or less unpunished violence that accompanied, or I guess we could say that characterized Jim Crow is hardly unknown, but never have we seen that violence and the forms that it took and the indifference, if not outright collusion of state actors unearthed and laid out with such vividness, with such terrible vividness, and the eerie recurrence of George Floyd as a victim in the 1940s and another George Floyd in the 2020s, I think really speaks to the ongoing relevance. And my question, I guess, along with building on Alea and Alex's questions, concerns our own time, which is really shaping up to be a time of resurgent violence, expanding beyond violence wielded directly against people of color, legal and extra legal, but finding broader targets, officially sanctioned, ever more normalized violence against some of those very government institutions, the Congress, judicial officials, public officials from voting, voting ballot box places on up, who themselves in the past have had such a clearly inglorious record of protecting the welfare and the bodies of African Americans. And it just all, I guess, building on the earlier questions, I'm wondering how your study of what made Jim Crow violence tick back in those days shapes your sense of what makes our present day descent into an ever widening, more normalized forms of violence tick in our own time.
Thank you, Dan, for the question and hidden in it, the comment. Let me just go back to something that Alex said a moment ago, which is that when Emmett Till was pulled from the waters of the Tallahatchie River, there were other bodies as well. My view is that it's not enough to say there, and the reason we did this work is it's not enough to say there are other bodies. That's long been circulated, especially in African Americans communities. We talk about folks who were killed. We don't know their names. We don't know the circumstances. And at a certain point, they are not at rest. That's the first thing, just kind of as a moral matter. They are not at rest. We need to know who they were. But also, in order to have a full sense of the way in which violence has and continues to shape our political reality and the ongoing threat that it poses to our efforts to create a more perfect union, we have to know what happened in the past. And so my exploration of this period is with a view towards understanding that we've been here before and could be here certainly again, notwithstanding that the circumstances are so very different. That violence as a way of political conversating, as some of the folks in my community would say, has a long and deep tradition in our body politic, and that people of color, and here particularly African Americans, have been the targets of such violence in the past.
Thank you. Michael Binder, your hand is up. Unmute. Join the conversation.
Okay, so Michael Binder recently retired from the Air Force. By no means am I a civil rights historian. Not much of a historian, but I'm just back from a tour of Selma, Birmingham, Montgomery, Greensboro, and Atlanta. And so been to a lot of museums and such, where the exhibits are, I guess you could say they're kind of frozen at a moment. And I'm wondering if your book and if other books would change how history is presented in those museums, or would you say that they're accurate despite what new scholarship might come forward?
So that's a great question. I thank you for it, Michael, and I'm sure that Alex and Alia will also have a response to that. Alex has already responded by showing us an object from Louisiana commemorating the Crookshank events. So at the Smithsonian Museum, there is a unit that calls itself Restorative History. And the intent of this unit is to discuss American history in the context of items and memorabilia that show the history as a living object. And so if you go into the Smithsonian, you will see there a marker that was in the Mississippi County where Emmett Till was killed, that was removed from the county and taken into the Smithsonian as an exhibition. And the reason for it is because the marker was repeatedly shot through with bullets. And every time that community replaced the damaged marker with a new marker, that marker too would be defaced and shot through with bullets. And so this Emmett Till marker is in the Smithsonian, and it's a way of, as you say, Michael, of updating the material that we use to create memory and to create understanding and to show the reiteration of the forms of violence that these museums have tried to represent, the Memphis Museum, the Birmingham Museum, and so on and so forth, and to contemporize them in a way that makes clear that the debates that drove the violence that created the bodies in the river, that they still form the culture the practices of our time are still in many ways governed by those violent forces.
Thank you. We have a question posed on the Q&A function from Tammy Hilburn. She is the Cultural Property Crime Consultant for the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition. And she asks, do you think the erasure of forensic evidence at historic African burial grounds is an inherent part of a master plan? And she asks if you think that the bioarchaeological erasure of the burial grounds themselves in this country is a type of ethnic cleansing.
I'll let Alex and Alia take a shot at that one first so that we can fully create a full circle here.
Jump in.
Who's going to go first?
Go, Alex. I actually have a
I don't
comment
know
on
if I
the
can
previous
answer that
question.
question. I mean, is there a master plan? I don't know. I mean, again, to my mind, there is this ongoing struggle over memory, which Michael just referred to in his question as well. I mean, I've been to a lot of the same sites, not to Greensboro, but to Selma, to Montgomery, to the new EJI installation there, to Mississippi, to the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, which also has this shot up sign, which they brought, by the way, also to the Indianapolis Children's Museum for the exhibit there that just opened that's going to travel around the country. So I actually don't find that the memory in these museums is frozen in time. I think, you know, I'm more optimistic about it. I think it brings the memories back to life. And so I'm pleased about that. And I've taken South African students to these sites, and it was really an amazing trip. That's a little different than the erasure of burial grounds. So, I mean, I do think on the one hand, there was a master plan, which is that, you know, there's been this history of erasure, of, you know, hiding the truth about history, hiding the truth about white violence and white supremacy. But in terms of bringing it back to light, I actually think this is a pretty optimistic moment, whether it's historical sites, rewriting or taking, I don't know whether that sign in Colfax is still there or not, but I'm very confident it's not going to be for much longer. This is why, in fact, the right wing is so upset, because they're losing this battle over memory right now. Now, again, a lot of, you know, things may change over the next few days, right? So I don't know enough about graveyard practices, but I would say that, you know, I mean, the one I know that I've been to is the one in New York, the African burial ground. So that was just buried under Wall Street. Now it's actually a historic site. There are other places where you could see more done. When I went to Holly Springs, Mississippi, I was amazed to see there that Hiram Revels, who was a key, you know, Black activist during Reconstruction and a Black senator, I believe, during Reconstruction, his grave is sitting right there in a beautiful cemetery on a hill up above Holly Springs, Mississippi. But there's nothing special marked there. So there are opportunities, I think, still for these historical markers. I'll leave it at that.
So, yeah, and I think, Alex, there's a reclamation that's going on, whether it's neighborhoods that were destroyed by highways, you know, throughout America, or finding these burial grounds, that there is you know, the preservation movement. Certainly the National Trust for Historic Preservation has its African American preservation wing that is trying to make sure that some of these places that were erased are restored or recognized. So it's preservation heritage in some way, since many of the physical, much of the physical evidence is gone. Alex and I were both at the opening of the Emmett Till exhibit at the Children's Museum in Indianapolis. Extremely well done, and will be with the Emmett Till Foundation, and it will be going to 6 different cities for 6 weeks at a time. It'll be in DC in January, I think. So I just to think about what museums are trying to do, it's when you think about the budgets that museums have, they're always underfunded. So it's very hard to refresh them. But I think these stories are being updated and supplemented with visuals. Margaret, I didn't get to watch the documentary that was done based on your work. Maybe you can talk about that. But you can see these exhibits, or go online and find other things that sort of add to whatever may appear to be static in a particular museum exhibit.
I would just add, American history is just one giant cold case that's being reinvestigated. But one more thing, and then I'll let you answer, Margaret. I was just this morning, I picked someone up at a hotel in downtown Indianapolis. That hotel happens to be in the Bethel AME Church on Vermont Avenue in the center of Indianapolis. So there's a site that could use a little reclamation. It is on the National Historic Register of Places and all that, but it's a hotel. So there are all sorts of interesting projects that, if you just look around, are going to be in your community. We should talk about that, Ilya. I'd like to see something done there, actually.
Well, what I would add here is that we need all of these forms of collection and retaining of memory. We need to draw on a wide range of knowledge practices, and it strikes me that that's what Tammy seems to be calling up here. Is lots and lots of people are looking at burial grounds and thinking about what can be recovered there, and what does that tell us about our past, and what do we need to do with that information. And so there's space here not just for those of us who are professionally trained, lawyers and other researchers, but as well for folks who come to this with other forms of knowledge and abilities to engage here in embodied ways, to begin to look at how we preserve this history before it's lost, because it will be lost. Let me just say that with respect to my book, at the end of my book, I've got a list of folks who have passed away since we talked to them about these events. They added, critical details about these cases, and these folks they're aging and they're passing on. And if we think this history is important, now is the time to go and grab it.
I would be curious, Tammy, if you're thinking about a sort of NAGPRA for these kind of remains, right? That is, Native Americans have dedicated legislation to protecting their grave sites and remains and essentially forensic evidence. So maybe we need that in this case as well.
Thank you. Eric Sterling's hand has been up. He's been waiting patiently. Unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Terrific conversation, and I really commend Professor Burnham. So at various times, politicians exploit a fear of crime. This can be for electoral purposes, such as George H.W. Bush, Lee Atwater, and the exploitation of Willie Horton. It also drives legislation, which was the case in the Congress with the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 88, and the 1994 Crime Bill. During the historical period you have studied, Professor Burnham, was there in the South a political exploitation of crime, constructed as crime of people of color and needing more punishment, at the same time that these unnoticed, uninvestigated, unprosecuted murders of Black people were taking place that you've documented in By Hands Now Known?
Thanks for that question, Mr. Sterling. And thanks for calling me Professor Burnham. Someone called me doctor. Don't ask me to do anything physical with you, and I don't have any other kind of doctoral degree either. That's Eric and Alex and other folks. So, but yes, in the book, I document an incident in Birmingham that I think illustrates what it is you're driving at, which is the racialization of the issue of crime in order to drive racial divides and drive racial politics. And in this case, there was a demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, following the death of a young man by a dentist, and the streets were filled with people who came out to protest. And in the immediate wake of the protest, Bull Connor got the city fathers to pass an ordinance that banned public gatherings on the street. And so, the language is neutral, but it was used really to ramp up the racial policing of the streets in Birmingham, Alabama. The case that I described that followed on the heels of this ordinance was one in which an African-American man sought to go into a movie theater. He's asked by the police officers to stand in line. One thing leads to another. He ends up in the back of the police car and is beaten, and his name is James Jackson, beaten and killed. John Jackson, beaten and killed. So repeatedly, crime, the bogeyman of crime and racial crime, crime caused by African Americans, for which African Americans are responsible, is repeatedly used across the South to reinforce Jim Crow, not only Jim Crow, to show the need for Jim Crow. Without Jim Crow, we would be overwhelmed by Black crime, but not just to show the need for Jim Crow, but also to show the need for anti-crime measures that are disproportionately used to affect, lock up, and criminalize the African-American community. So this is not new to the 1960s, doesn't start with Nixon and those who followed him, LBJ first, but then Nixon and the others. But rather, this is something that is going on in local communities across the South. We need Jim Crow. If you want to be safe, we need Jim Crow. And it's particularly effective in those counties in the South that are where there are large African-American, either majorities, or where there are majorities or large minorities. And, this idea that if we don't hold the line here, and if we don't use our police to aggressively enforce Jim Crow, we will be, quote unquote, swamped, is a critical element of excuse me, of the violence. And not only that, but it's also critical to the way African-American responsibility for crime is perceived on a national level. So we will all remember that Ronald Reagan famously started his campaign for presidency down in Neshoba, Mississippi. So what does that tell us? It tells us, not only is he celebrating the heinous crime, 1964 crime in Neshoba, but he's also celebrating the sheriff and the law enforcement people in that county. It's maybe it's a whisper. It's a fairly large whisper and one that resonates across time. So this is we see this on the national level. Of course, my colleague at Yale Law School wrote this wonderful book that complicates this, called James Foreman's book, Locking Up Our Own, that talks about African-American involvement in efforts to reinforce crime control in the 1980s. But it starts with Jim Crow. Or at least Jim Crow has a large role in the politicization of so-called Black crime.
Thank you. My turn to get a question in. So I think all of us on this panel who did not write this book, when we read it, we were moved, we were disturbed, we were depressed, we were horrified. Even though we read many accounts of racial violence, this book still is disturbing at a profound level. So maybe this is a historical question on my part. The book recounts with such clarity the sheer savagery and sadism of so many Southern law enforcement officials, of bus drivers and the like, who just freely and wantonly engage in sadistic terror. Okay, we on the panel read this and we're disturbed. I'm now wondering about the Department of Justice officials that you write about here. As I read the accounts, there's a certain dispassionate sense that I get, and I haven't read the document, so maybe it's there and I'm just not seeing it. And so they're encountering these stories. They may even be encountering the stories in their most raw form, and yet they assess, they sift. It's like, we won't be able to get sufficient evidence, They learn from their mistakes and they don't get convictions. So there's no passion or sense of passion on their part. They see the sadism and they basically take a pass, at least in many instances. Am I being too critical of their professional and human responses? Because it's just sort of hard. And again, this is the ahistorical part. With our sensibilities today, this is horrifying. I don't get the sense that they look at these cases and say, we're horrified, we want to go after it. It's more like, maybe we can, maybe we can't.
But that's exactly, I think you've captured it really well, and I appreciate that. And I also think that this is absolutely the case. But here, Eric, I think is where the national story clicks in. Because we're really talking about legal bureaucrats, and I use that word not in a pejorative sense at all. These are folks who are working in our federal institutions in Washington, D.C., and God bless them for their public service. But, we're also talking about a time in which African Americans were just not seen as part of the national conversation. So, were there African American communities that politicians had to be aware of and sensitive to? Yes, but there was no real sense that this was a constituency that mattered. That mattered. It just did not matter. And so, if you had a prosecutor who was, let's say from Delaware, and he's working down in Washington, D.C., and they all were and he's working in Washington, D.C. in the Justice Department under Frank Murphy. And someone in Montgomery, Alabama says to him, I can't do that case in this community down there. His answer is going to be, okay, fine. Don't do it. He's not, in other words, the moral outrage that you're expressing is a 2022 moral compass. It's not a 1940s moral compass. Back then, these were, African American communities were not seen as, worthy recipients of public service. The letters back and forth between Thurgood Marshall they're frustrating. They're damning of what the response of the DOJ was in these cases. Marshall writes over and over and over again after Charles Hamilton Houston has his shot at it. Marshall is writing, and then after him, Constance Baker Motley, they're writing and they're saying, look at this, do something about it. And the federal government, as you say, they're making their calculations. In some cases, they're political. But in all cases, they're political. And at the end of the day, their community are those Southern prosecutors and those Southern law enforcement officers who they see as their professional community. And there's no Black folk anywhere around, by the way, not in the DOJ, not in Washington, not in any of the local offices. So it's a very different landscape. And I think we have to appreciate that this is a utterly subordinated, the violence I talk about is in the South, but it's an African-American community. While, we have Joy, we have entrepreneurs, we have Madam Walker, we have all that, but it's a politically subordinated community. And that's what you see in these Justice Department records.
Can I ask a quick question, Margaret? I mean, some of these records that I've seen, I've come across a name, and I wonder if you came across Eleanor Bontecu. Bontecu, Bontecu. So she was in the civil rights section of the Justice Department early on, and she, I think, had some passion. I mean, as you're suggesting, her passion was easily swamped by the political calculus of the day. But I'm curious about people like her, individuals sort of inside the office. She was an attorney, who actually brought some passion to this kind of work. You
Well,
should
so,
check her
okay,
out. It's interesting.
So you could have one or two folks like that, but let me also just explain something else. Prosecutors get promoted by winning cases. If they don't win cases, they're not going to get bumped up. They're never going to be U.S. attorney. That's just not going to happen. Attorney General, never. Judge, never. You got to win cases first. So there's a disincentive for line prosecutors to take these cases. And yes, Eric is right. They never figured out. Well, if they could figure out, I mean, the cards are stacked against them. They're all white jurors. They're all white male jurors going into courtrooms where the black folk are sitting, even in federal courtrooms, they're sitting in the back of the courtroom if they're in there at all. So the deck is already stacked against them. And there just was not individuals perhaps, but there certainly was not the institutional passion to figure a way out and a way around that.
That certainly comes through depressingly in the accounts that you provide us. From the question and answer section here, we have Mike Hankins with the following. No matter how often I hear examples, I'm always shocked at how many African Americans in military service were victims of racist violence, in many cases while they were literally in uniform. And he says, my question is, did military service play any role at all increasing the acceptance or humanization of African Americans in the larger society or not? And then I would add a question to that. Just as the DOJ passed on so many cases and did not do due diligence in pursuing these cases, what was the role of the War Department, say, during World War II in the cases that you look at?
Okay, great question. So first of all, with respect to military service, I touch on this. I think I do a nice job. My colleague, Matthew Delmont, does a far better, far more comprehensive job in his book, Half American. I can't remember what's on the other side of that colon, but it's a fabulous book. And I urge the questioner and everyone else interested in the role of African Americans. First of all, we would not have a 20th century civil rights movement such as we had 1954 to 1968 were it not for African Americans who went to the war and came back and felt there was a different world to be lived. They had seen part of it, and there was a different world they wanted to fight for. They were on the front lines. Those veterans who came back were on the very front lines of the civil rights movement of the late 1940s, early 1950s. Many of them got better jobs because of military service. That can't be denied. But even while we're looking at that part of the flag, we got to look at the other part of the flag too, which is that they were mistreated at every turn, and that the War Department was not there. For the most part, when the mistreatment was based on race, the War Department, for the most part, not every time, but for the most part, simply was not there for them. We know that Judge, his name I've forgotten, I'm sorry, it's slipped my mind. He was a judge, one of our first federal judges in the Virgin Islands, worked in the War Department as an attaché, and then left because he was so disgusted at the failure. Hasty, thank you very much. At the failure of the Judge Hasty, William Hasty, failure of the War Department to treat African American soldiers as equal Americans.
And so just a very final quick question. Where do scholars go from here? There's a database created, there are sources. What would you recommend to those looking for topics? Where would you direct them?
May 1,000 PhD theses bloom. And I say that because, after Tolnay and Beck's wonderful work that came out in 1995 in the book Festival of Violence, which was accompanied by a very rich database just on lynching, 1,000 PhD theses did bloom. It pushed our knowledge forward enormously. And, I can't say, we haven't really looked at gender in the specificity which it deserves, but it's available there in the archives. There are going to be stories about LGBT communities that can be pulled out, plumbed from this archive. So there's regional studies and city studies. I've touched on Birmingham. There's a lot more work to be done on places like Birmingham. Why is Birmingham so different from Jackson? Why is Jackson so different from Atlanta, and Atlanta so different from Charlotte with respect to violence? There's just a lot of work to be done, and we're continuing to build our archive, and we hope that the archive will be inspiring for those young scholars who are out there looking for topics.
Thank you so much. I unfortunately now have the task of drawing this session to a close, and my apologies to everyone who still has a question in the Q&A or a hand up. Sorry we couldn't get to you. I think we could have gone on for quite some time this evening. So my thank you to our panelists today, Margaret, Alilia, Alex, and I want to extend to those of you in the audience 2 invitations. You can join us this Thursday, November 10th at 4 p.m. when we delve into a different subject, Republics of Myth, National Narratives, and the U.S.-Iran conflict. And then we invite you back yet again next Monday on November 14th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for a session on ideology in U.S. foreign relations, new histories. We hope you can join us for both. Again, thank you, everyone. And until our next session, take care, be safe. Good night.